My name is Michael Gano. In this presentation, I will be performing a demographic review of U.S. presidential politics from 2000 to 2016. I call it the Great Sort. On November 8, 2016, a political earthquake shook the world. In spite of the low expectations of political analysts, Donald Trump, a real estate mogul and reality TV star with a controversial message of anti-immigration, populism, and nationalism, won the presidency. Commentators at the time noted that the white working class had shifted to the Republicans as his opponent Hillary Clinton had lost what she considered to be a Midwestern blue wall. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania had unexpectedly shifted to the GOP side. Though the Trump victory was unexpected, I would argue, in retrospect, that it was a logical continuation of a coalition shift more than 15 years in the making that was done mostly due to economic factors. Indeed, from 2000 to 2016, the electorate self-sorted between two parties, not along ideological lines, but rather along demographic lines, between the cities and rural areas, between highly educated white-collar jobs and blue-collar workers, and also along lines of race and ethnicity. And indeed, this can be seen in the evolution of the vote with these demographic variables. As I will demonstrate in this presentation, these trends are not new, but they were definitely accelerated in the 2016 election. Now, in order to perform this analysis, I retrieved demographic data from the U.S. Census Bureau, including data from the American Community Survey, or for earlier dates, the decennial census files. We will be primarily looking at educational attainment, race, and ethnicity as demographic variables in this presentation. But other variables have also been retrieved for certain parts of the presentation as well. From the election data, I have retrieved a data set that was provided by the MIT Election Data Lab, and which has compiled historical U.S. election results and makes them freely available for research purposes. Now, that data for county level information goes back to 2000, and I use county level data in order to get a sufficient level of granularity. State level data does not allow for enough variability among demographic lines for the purposes of this analysis, and lower level data is difficult to come by. We're also only going to focus on the lower 48 states and the District of Columbia, as it is pretty difficult to correlate election results from Alaska with the state subdivisions. Now, because of this choice, certain lines are difficult to draw which are otherwise relevant to this analysis. There isn't much variability among counties with respect to sex or gender, for instance, so it would be difficult to draw conclusions from this data. Unfortunately, census data is not available for certain categories which are not collected by the U.S. Census Bureau for privacy or jurisdictional reasons, such as sexuality, religious practice, or union membership. Now let's take a step back to discuss the American political system. The United States operates under a strong two-party system. On the left, the Democratic Party was founded in 1828 by Andrew Jackson. Its current ideology is based on the legacy of the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, international cooperation, and progressivism. The Democratic Party is often represented by the color blue or by a donkey. On the right, the Republican Party, which is often referred to as the Grand Old Party, or GOP, was founded in 1854 by opponents of slavery. And though somewhat in flux following the election of Donald Trump, its current ideology is American conservatism, which means the promotion of free markets, pro-business and traditionalist social policies, and more recently, economic nationalism and populism. It is represented by the color red and an elephant. Now, you may have noticed that both parties have dominated American politics for nearly 150 years. Now, that kind of longevity is unusual in liberal democracies, and it is only explained by their ability to form diverse coalitions of interest groups. Now, because of the entrenched two-party nature of the system, the American parties are always competing to gain more voters than their opposition and to expand their coalition. This can be done by appealing to opposition voters or otherwise to new voters. For instance, the Democrats have long maintained a significant advantage with young voters. But it is important to recognize that coalitions shift significantly over time, and this is how a party which was ostensibly created to fight against slavery, the Republicans, now struggles to appeal to African Americans. In fact, the Republican Party faces a significant demographic dilemma as several trends seem to be favorable to the Democrats. First of all, the U.S. population of Hispanic or Latino origin has significantly increased in the past 20 years. Secondly, college education is also on the rise. That means a higher propensity of white-collar work and the decline of blue-collar jobs. But at the same time, traditional values are also on the decline across the country, as shown by marriage rates. Now, these trends are strong enough that Democratic political strategist John Judas and Rui Teixeira pointed out that without a significant change in political ideologies, the Democrats would enjoy a permanent majority due to these trends. The Republicans are aware of this challenge and are highly aware of their need to expand their coalition. Meanwhile, the Democrats have every incentive to embrace these new demographics. So as we will see, initially at least, it seems that the Democratic Party took this information to heart, while the Republicans had a difficult time adjusting to this looming reality. But as we will see, most of what they accomplished was to consolidate the South and Appalachia. But that was not enough. So here's a quick note on a concept that's often used by political analysts in the United States. It is broadly understood that in a national election, such as for the U.S. presidency, changes in vote share for one party or another between two elections are due, in the first order, to nationwide sentiments about the candidates. In order to understand local voting patterns over time, it is often necessary to remove that first-order effect and analyze what experts call the partisan voting index, or PVI. The way you calculate PVI is very simple. You calculate the average popular vote for the country at large. Then you calculate how far from that average popular vote a specific geography has voted. Another quick aside is to explain how presidential elections work in the United States. Now, the United States does not elect its presidents according to a nationwide popular vote majority. Instead, the election consists of 51 state-level contests, including one in the District of Columbia. Each state decides by plurality vote who they want to be president. In turn, each state is allotted a certain number of electors in what is called the Electoral College. Now, the vast majority of these states allocate these electors based on a winner-take-all system, by which the popular vote winner in each state receives all the electors for that state. Now, these electors are sent to the Electoral College, which means in December or January following the election, at which point it actually elects the president. The system was designed to protect the federal nature of the United States, and it tends to favor smaller, more rural states. And as a result, on occasion, the winner of the election actually got fewer votes nationwide than the loser. This is not an unusual occurrence. In fact, this has happened twice in the past 20 years. It also means that generally it is pointless to campaign in a state in which either party has a significant advantage, as shifting the vote in the state from 70 to 60% of the vote will have no impact on the result of the election, while shifting one state from 49.9% to 50.1% will have a significant impact. Now, because of this, election campaigns tend to concentrate on a small number of battleground or swing states, while leaving safe states generally unvisited except as a source of fundraising. Now, with this in mind, let's take a look at the presidential elections from 2000 to 2012. This dashboard gives an overview of the salient points for each year. At the top, the national popular vote. However, as explained before, this is not what matters. Rather, what you need to look at is the bar right underneath this, which is the Electoral College result. Now, as you can see in 2000, the Republican, George W. Bush, won against the Democrat, Al Gore, by a very slim majority in the Electoral College, even though Al Gore had won more of the popular vote. That being said, I'd like you to take a look at just how close that election really was. There were so many states right here in gray, and that would indicate a margin of victory of less than 1%. In fact, the Florida election was so close that it went through several recounts lasting for over a month, eventually culminating in a battle in the Supreme Court. It's a fascinating story, and I definitely recommend you look into it if you don't know much about it. Now, on the bottom left, you'll see a map indicating how each county voted in that election. The redder the county, the more Republican it voted. Conversely, the bluer the county, the more Democratic it voted. And finally, on the bottom right, a chart which I like to call the champagne bubble chart. I call it that way because it reminds me of that foam which pops out of the bottle when you pop open a bottle of champagne. But behind this party-like exterior, there is a ton of data to observe. So here we chart each county on a 2D plane with each circle or dot representing one county. And the y-axis represents the county's PVI in that year's election, the partisan voting index, which we just talked about. Now, as we saw earlier, the PVI is a measure of how much more Republican or Democratic than the rest of the country a specific county is. The higher the dot, the more Democratic it voted. The lower the dot, the more Republican it voted. Now, on the x-axis, we have the level of college education in the county. So, for instance, in this particular county has about 50% of people who have a bachelor's degree or better. Now, we charted this college education variable because it is closely related to several other demographic measures, such as blue-collar or white-collar propensity, as well as median income. We didn't use median income because median income is subject to inflation, and it would have been pretty difficult if we wanted to look at how many families are earning less than a certain level of income over time, because over 16 or 20 years, inflation is going to make a pretty big difference on that particular measure. So a family that was making $35,000 in 2000 does not have the same level of income, of disposable income, as a family that was making $35,000 in 2016. So instead, we looked at the level of education across the country, and it is a pretty interesting measure to look at. Now, the size of each circle indicates the population density of each county. So a big circle will tend to be a city, and these sizes tend to be pretty significantly variable. But these tiny little dots are actually very small circles, and they tend to be farm, country, or any kind of rural area where there's not a lot of density. And in between, mid-sized circles is probably going to be something like suburbs. Finally, the color of the bubble indicates the racial composition of the county. Whiter circle tends to indicate that there's more white people living there, and a browner circle tends to indicate that there are more minorities living there. Now, immediately you can see from this chart that certain patterns are already emerging, even in 2000. What you see is that there's a lot of bigger circles and browner marks near the top of the chart. So it seems at least that cities and racial minorities tend to vote more heavily Democratic. However, the vast majority of the counties are smaller white dots, rural, overwhelmingly white counties, and although there is a bias in favor of Republicans in 2000, it doesn't seem that it's that big of a bias. The line, that clump of counties seems to straddle over the 0% line, which indicates that there are quite a few of these counties that vote Democratic as well. But as you move forward throughout the years, you'll see that this separation gets bigger and bigger. Now, isn't that interesting? Let's go back a little bit. You can see that in real time that this sorting has been occurring, and using that PVI makes it very clear that this tendency happened in bad years for Democrats or in great years like 2008. Over time, it seems that the country did split along these variables of race and ethnicity, education, and city versus country. But is that the whole story? To make it clearer, let's look at these spatial charts, which will allow us to visualize the change in PVI across the country since the 2000 election, as compared to the variables that I included in the Champagne bubble chart. So you have population density on the top right, race and ethnicity on the bottom left, and college education on the bottom right. Now on the top left, what you have is the change in the PVI since 2000 across the years. One thing you will notice as I advance through the years is that the demographic variables do not change very much. Now sure, the race and ethnicity chart gets a bit more brown in the west, the college education map gets a bit brighter, but that seems to be a broad countrywide effect rather than something that varies significantly from one county to the next. In fact, looking at these changes in these variables tend to be very noisy. Now meanwhile, there have been some pretty significant changes in voter preference across the country. But note that these changes, the nationwide changes, do tend to correlate pretty well with other variables we see here. Now, can you see it? Let's take a closer look at the areas which show the most significant PVI change shifts between 2000 and 2012, the South and the Appalachian Mountain Range. What immediately pops out here is that there's a lot of red here. There's a lot of red. Republicans did a lot better in 2012 than in 2000. There's also a lot of zones of blue. So along the Mexican border, in Texas, and also along what is commonly known as the Black Belt that goes from Washington, D.C. to the Mississippi River. Now, these are counties in which many cotton plantations relying on slaves prior to the Civil War were staying, and as a result, the descendants of these slaves still form a majority of these counties. As you can see right here, it's a very significant majority-minority area. That correlation is staggering, though, don't you think? The more minorities in a county, the further left it moved, while by and large, the heavily white rest of the South seemed to move rightward. And note that the correlation between high-density population areas and moving towards the Democrats as well. So high-density population cities tended to be blue. This is in line with what we said before, isn't it? So how did this happen? Well, let's take a look at the Mid-Atlantic states, which I like to think of because they are a very good microcosm of what I think has been happening. Here you see a map of the counties of Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. And the first thing you might notice is that in 2000, although there are some pretty significant variations across the area, the main driver seems to be along lines of urban versus rural rather than race, and even that isn't completely clear, as you can see in the south of West Virginia and the western end of Virginia. In fact, the bubble chart here shows that aside from the big cities near the top, there isn't much of a separation in rural areas along lines of race. There isn't much of an education bias either. So let's look at how the area evolved between 2000 and 2012. And what you can see is that West Virginia, that goes from leaning Democratic to one of the more deeply red states in a very short period of time, most dramatically between 2004 and 2008. Now, this mirrors a move in much of Appalachia from Pennsylvania all the way down to Alabama. And if you look at the race and ethnicity map, you could be forgiven for thinking that the election of the first black man as president of the United States may have played a significant role and a significant factor in this shift. But look more closely, and I think you'll find that education plays a much more significant part in the sorting than race does. You see these areas right here? And right here? Charlottesville right here? Right here? It seems that the bluer areas tend to be the highly educated areas, rather than just looking at race. Now, why might that be? Well, let's go back to 2000. One thing that you might not know about these areas near the southwest of the map is that they are areas which have a lot of coal production. As you can see from this overlaid map from the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey. Now that makes sense. Blue-collar, working-class, unionized households have tended to vote Democratic since the New Deal. So Democratic presence here is definitely expected. This is significant because although the Democratic and Republican parties were broadly in agreement about global warming policy in the late 1990s, remember that the U.S. Senate unanimously rejected the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. Their positions had diverged much more significantly by 2008. With Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama candidly, and one might say unpolitically, announced that his global warming plan would result in many coal plant closures, a policy position that was overwhelmingly supported by college-educated people. Now, this is where the education gap plays a massive role. As you can see, local politics didn't change significantly from 2000 to 2004. But in 2008, faced with the possibility of a massive shutdown of their overall industry, coal miners, who tend to have no college education, overwhelmingly shifted away from their union-led Democratic leanings and towards the Republicans, who were much more willing to listen to their policy concerns. And as all things in politics, this concern sometimes veered into extremes, such as outright global warming denialism in certain sections of the Republican base. These positions hardened in 2012. Now, am I saying that this is the only factor in this shift, or that racial politics didn't play a role? Definitely not. It's clear that there is a divergence between the races at these low education levels. And as I mentioned, the more educated the county, the more it moved towards the Democrats. But I hope you'll agree that racism was far from the only factor in the Appalachian shift towards the Republicans. In fact, I would argue that it probably took a distant second place to economic concerns in the area. Now, this is an interesting pattern to look at. There is a divergence by race at low education levels. But there is a divergence by race at low education levels. But as the education levels go up, clearly there was a move towards the Democrats over time. This sort of swoosh pattern is something you can see quite a bit across the United States. So, what about the 2016 election? What about Trump? Well, the interesting thing here is that the data doesn't show him having much of an impact on this area beyond the momentum that had already started in 2008. And in fact, the trends we see here are a straightforward continuation of what we saw in the previous two elections. Well, I would be remiss not to point out that at this point, the racial divide, which may have been incidental as much as was deliberate before, may have become a primary driver in this conversation. Let's not forget that Charlottesville is in Virginia, and that became the epicenter of one of the darkest moments of the Trump presidency, with white supremacist riots disrupting the college town, resulting in one death. But, and this was surprising to me, the initiation of this trend seems to be much more related to the white working class, which was used to support unions shifting over more towards Republicans as economic concerns favored by coal miners in mostly white areas battle against environmental concerns favored by the more educated classes in more racially diverse urban areas. And as we will see in the next few slides, a similar pattern repeated in 2016 with Trump's election. Let's take a look at the 2016 election. Now, many analysts discussed Trump's anti-immigration policies and racial resentment as being key to his victory, but I think something else was at play. And I will argue that it was in fact Trump's anti-trade protectionist message which led to his victory. Let's take a look at the 2016 election. The first thing you'll note is that Trump lost the popular vote by a significant margin, 2.1%. In which what has been a boost for the proponents of a national popular vote election. Of course, why would the Electoral College give you a president which was voted by that much fewer people than the people who voted against him? Now, that being said, as discussed quite clearly by the punditry at the time of the election, Trump massively appealed to the white working class in a way that Republicans hadn't been able to do previously. And this can be seen in the champagne bubble chart with the way that it shifted between 2012 and 2016. Also, it's pretty clear that Trump's message didn't play well with the college-educated, and there is now very clearly a diagonal appearing under the bubbles in the champagne chart. A clear correlation between college education and the propensity to vote for Trump. But is that all the story? Well, the data don't really seem to indicate that's the case. If anything, it seems that Trump's anti-immigration message, and particularly the construction of a border wall, was not a winning message in border states with Mexico. These states pretty significantly moved towards the Democrats. With the exception of New Mexico, which stayed pretty much constant. What about racial resentment? Well, that's pretty unclear. In the South, where one might expect to see most of these types of views, first of all, Trump didn't move any electoral college votes in that area, regardless of whether racists picked up on his alleged dog whistles. But even then, there wasn't a significant break from earlier trends in 2016. Only Georgia had a massive inflection compared to previous years, and even then it was in favor of the Democrats. No, rather, I would argue that it was trade policies that Trump moved the needle. Breaking with decades of free trade policies by the Republican Party, Trump promised to be tough on China, renegotiate trade agreements, and in particular the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which he argued had been a disaster for the auto and manufacturing industries. Now, by contrast, his opponent, Mrs. Clinton, defended NAFTA, which had been one of the signature achievements of her husband's presidency. And clearly, Mr. Trump's message resonated with workers and voters in the so-called Rust Belt states. Now, these are Midwestern states with a significant presence of unionized and therefore traditionally democratic blue-collar manufacturing workers, which had felt left behind by American trade policy. And his economic rationale for Mr. Trump's win explains why he made such significant gains in the Midwest. States like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio. His big gains also in farm-heavy Iowa were of the same vein, because there had been a significant discussion of farm subsidies and trade policy in the presidential election. And finally, this message combined with economic concerns about global warming in coal and fracking heavy Pennsylvania, deepening a trend towards the Republicans that had lasted since the 2008 election. I would argue that Trump, who has been skeptical of U.S. trade policy much longer than any of his other policy positions, knew exactly what he was doing with this messaging. And his choice of a popular Midwestern governor as his running mate is further evidence of that. So as we discussed, Trump won the presidency despite losing the popular vote by 2.1%. And looking at the PVI change map, it's easy to see how he did it. Hillary Clinton's primary gains were in California and in the cities, particularly in the Acela corridor from D.C. to Boston. But the thing is, these areas were already heavily Democratic, so the gain in popular votes she received there were not useful in adding to the Electoral College. Meanwhile, Trump leveraged his protection and populist policy to make significant gains in the Rust Belt, areas which had traditionally tended more Democratic due to union membership. No wonder Mrs. Clinton failed to foresee Mr. Trump's victory in this area. The extent to which his message resulted in wins in these Democratic strongholds was honestly quite shrewd. But it was also in the same vein as earlier Republican gains in the Appalachian states, with unionized white working class voters shifting to Republicans on primarily economic concerns. So Trump won because he swung several Midwestern states to the Republicans by a small margin, while Mrs. Clinton had massive gains in popular vote in the cities and in California, but that had no impact on the Electoral College. Now, looking at the evolution of the PVI in the Midwest between 2012 and 2016, it can be tempting to paint a picture of low education white voters responding en masse to Trump's anti-immigration message. And indeed, the data do show that this demographic did significantly shift towards Trump in 2016. But correlation is not causation. Mr. Trump's gains were, in my opinion, primarily driven by union manufacturing workers who were attracted to his anti-trade message. And there's a pretty strong case that by and large, these workers just happen to be white, because that is the overwhelming demographic of that part of the United States. So what conclusions can we draw from this data? Well, it seems that the Democrats may have sought certain policy goals which led to them losing one of their strongest allies, the white working class. And one can argue as to whether this is a good thing or not. Certainly the policy goals they seek are laudable: a cleaner environment, a more open United States, a more just society. But have they abandoned some people who relied on them for protection along the way, in a way which may have been contrary to their historical policy goals? Trump's shrewd political calculation seems to indicate that yes, this may have been an issue, and Midwestern union workers were eager to jump ship when thrown a lifeline by a billionaire from New York who, on the face of it, has nothing in common with them. But one cannot ignore that for now, the country is divided along demographic lines, particularly racial ones. Trump's messaging hurt the GOP's already weak standing with racial and ethnic minorities. No matter what the source of this division, this is causing some significant problems in American society, and the president has failed to address these tensions. So what's next? Well, it seems that the Democratic Party has learned, in part, from its mistakes in 2016. Given that the two most popular candidates in the primary election were Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, there is a clear yearning for a strong left-wing answer to Trump with respect to the white blue-collar workers. Whether they can succeed in 2020 remains to be seen. That being said, Judas and Teixeira's predictions remain unchallenged, and if the Republicans rely on the non-college educated whites to the exclusion of anyone else, they will run into some significant issues going forward. Now, that is why in 2014, a group of Republican lawmakers known as the Gang of Six attempted to work on a compromise immigration reform bill with the Democrats. Now, this was ostensibly to reach out to the fast-growing Hispanic contingent in the United States. However, these politicians lost significant credibility when the Republican base as a result, and it is unlikely that they will have significant leadership roles in the party going forward. Now, Trump himself has expressed a willingness to reach out to African Americans, but it is unlikely that these efforts will succeed in the near term. So if you can't reach out over lines of race, what's next? Longer term, one approach that the Republicans may take is to make plausible proposals to address climate change. Offering an alternative will allow for gains with college-educated voters, but they will need to be careful not to lose their support in the Appalachian states as a result.